The Inheritance and Etiology of the Neurosis. Sigmund Freud. The Inheritance and Etiology of the Neurosis. I am addressing especially the students of J.M. Charcot, to present some objections against the etiological theory of neuroses, which our common teacher has transmitted to us. Known is the role attributed to nervous heredity in this theory. It would be the only true and indispensable cause of neurotic affections, and the other etiological influences can only aspire to the category of provocative agents. This has been affirmed by more than the same teacher, his disciples Guénon, Gilles de la Tourette and Janet, with regard to hysteria, also holding in France, and a little everywhere. This same opinion in relation to the other neuroses, although as regards these states, analogous to hysteria, it has not been stated so solemnly and decidedly. I have been suspecting the correctness of this theory for a long time, but I had to wait until I found facts on which to base myself in the daily practice of the doctor. Now my objections are already of two orders: factual arguments and other products of speculation. I will start with the first ones, ordering them according to the importance that I give them. 1. A. Sometimes they have thought they were nervous, and demonstrative of a hereditary neuropathic tendency, conditions that are foreign to the domain of neuropathology, and that do not necessarily depend on a disease of the nervous system. Thus, facial neuralgia and many headaches, which they were believed to be nervous, being rather consequences of post-infectious pathological alterations and suppurations in the pharyngonasal cavitary system. For my part, I am convinced that it would be to the advantage of the patients if we neurologists more frequently abandoned the treatment of such affections to rhinologists. B. It has been accepted as sufficient reason to suppose that a patient has hereditary nervous defects, all the nervous affections found in his family, without taking into account their frequency or severity. This way of seeing things seems to contain a precise separation between families free of any nervous predisposition and families subject to it without limit or restriction, provided that the facts rather argue in favor of the contrary opinion, according to which there are transitions and degrees of nervous disposition, without any family being completely unscathed by it. C. Our opinion on the etiological role of heredity. In nervous diseases it must, of course, be the result of an impartial statistical examination and not of a petitio principii. As long as this examination has not been carried out, the existence of acquired neuropathies as well as hereditary neuropathies should be assumed. Now, if there can be neuropathies acquired by undisposed men, it cannot be denied that the nervous affections found in the patient's family have partly this origin, and then it will not be possible to invoke them as conclusive evidence of the hereditary disposition, imposed on the patient by reason of his family history, since the retrospective diagnosis of diseases of absent ancestors or relatives is only rarely successful. D. Those who follow Fournier and Herb regarding the etiological role of syphilis in tabs dorsalis and paralysis progressive have seen that it is necessary to recognize in the pathogenesis of certain diseases the collaboration of powerful etiological influences other than heredity, important to produce them by themselves. However, Charcot was until his last time, as evidenced by a private letter that I possess, absolutely opposed to Fournier's theory, which is gaining more ground every day. There is no doubt that certain neuropathies can develop in perfectly healthy individuals from irreproachable families. This is commonly observed with regard to Beard's neurasthenia. If neurasthenia were limited to predisposed individuals, it would never have acquired the importance and extent that we know it to be. F. In nervous pathology there is similar heredity and heredity called dissimilar. As regards the first, there is nothing to object to, even being very singular that in conditions dependent on similar heredity, Thomson's disease, Friedreich's disease, myopathies, Huntington's chorea, etc. Never the trace of another accessory etiological influence. But the dissimilar inheritance, much more important than the other, leaves gaps that would need to be filled in order to reach a satisfactory solution to the etiological problems. We are referring to the fact that the members of the same family are shown to be visited by the most diverse, functional, and organic neuropathies, without being able to discover a law that directs the substitution of one disease for another or the order of its succession through the generations. Side by side with the sick individuals, there are in these families individuals who remain healthy, and the theory of dissimilar inheritance does not tell us why the latter bear the same hereditary burden without succumbing to it, nor why the sick individuals have chosen between the conditions that a particular disease rather than another constitutes the great neuropathic family, hysteria instead of epilepsy, madness, etc. Since no place can be given to chance in nervous pathogenesis, we must recognize that it is not heredity that presides over the choice of neuropathy that will develop in the member of a predisposed family, supposing, instead, the existence of other etiological influences of a less incomprehensible nature, influences that will then deserve the name of specific etiology of this or that nervous affection. Without in the existence of this special etiological factor, heredity could not have done anything, and if said specific etiology had been replaced by another influence, it would have led to the production of a different neuropathy. 2. Such specific causes and determinants of neuropathies have been little investigated, due to the great prospect of the hereditary etiological condition captivating the attention of physicians. However, they certainly deserve to be made the object of an assiduous study. Although its pathogenic power is, in general, only accessory to that of heredity, knowledge of this specific etiology must be extremely interesting, as it will provide our therapeutic work with a point of attack, while hereditary disposition fixed in advance for the patient from birth, it stops our efforts, showing itself as an unapproachable power. For my part, I have been dedicating myself for years to the investigation of the etiology of the great neuroses, functional nervous states analogous to hysteria, and the lines that follow contain the result of these studies. In order to avoid any possible misinterpretation, I will first present two observations on the nosography of neuroses and on the etiology of neuroses in general. It has been necessary for me to begin my work with a nosographic innovation. I have found sufficient reasons to place obsessional neurosis alongside hysteria as an autonomous and independent affection, although most authors place the obsessions among the syndromes of mental degeneration or confuse them with neurasthenia. For my part, I have discovered, by examining its psychic mechanism, that obsessions are more closely linked to hysteria than we imagined. It is believed hysteria and obsessional neurosis form the first group of the great neuroses studied by me. The second contains the Beard's neurasthenia, which I have broken down into two different functional states, both in terms of its etiology and its symptomatic aspect, neurasthenia proper and anxiety neurosis, the latter name which, by the way, does not quite satisfy me. In a study, published in 1895, I have explained the reasons for this separation, which I believe to be necessary. As regards the etiology of the neuroses, I think it should be recognized in theory that the etiological influences, different from each other by their category and by the order of their relation to the effect they produce, can be grouped into three classes: conditions, concurrent causes, and specific causes. The conditions are indispensable for the production of the affection in question, but their nature is universal, and they are also found in the etiology of many others diseases. The concurrent causes also collaborate in the causation of other affections but are not, like the conditions, indispensable for the production of a certain one. Finally, the specific causes are as indispensable as the conditions, but they appear only in the etiology of the affection, of which they are specific. Well then, in the pathogenesis of the great neuroses, heredity plays the role of a condition, powerful in all cases, and even essential in most of them. It certainly could not do without the collaboration of specific causes. But its importance is demonstrated by the fact that the same causes, acting on a healthy individual, would produce no manifest pathological effect, while their action on a predisposed person will give rise to neurosis, the intensity and extent of which will depend on the degree of such a condition. Hereditary The action of heredity is thus comparable to that of the multiplying wire in the electric circle, which exaggerates the visible deviation of the needle, but can never determine its direction. In the existing relations between the hereditary condition and the specific causes of the neurosis there is still something to note. The experience shows us something that we might have assumed beforehand, viz., that the relative amounts, so to speak, of etiological influences are not to be neglected in these questions of etiology. What would not have been guessed in the following fact, which seems to result from my observations: heredity and specific causes can be replaced as regards their quantitative side, and thus, the concurrence of a serious specific etiology with a mediocre disposition, and that of a very strong nervous heredity with a slight specific influence, will produce the same pathological effect. In this way, those neuroses, in which we look in vain for an appreciable degree of hereditary disposition, will be only one end of the series thus constituted, provided that this lack is compensated for by a powerful specific influence. As concurrent or accessory causes of the neuroses we may enumerate all the vulgar agents found in other occasions: moral emotions, somatic exhaustion, acute illnesses, poisoning, traumatic accidents, intellectual overload, etc. In my opinion, none of them, not even the last one, regularly or necessarily enters into the etiology of neurosis, and I know very well that to state this opinion is to place oneself in opposition to a theory considered universal or irreproachable. Since Beard declared that neurasthenia was the fruit of our modern civilization, only believers have found it. But for my part it is impossible for me to agree with this opinion. A laborious study of the neuroses has taught me that the specific etiology of the neuroses was hidden from Beard's knowledge. It is not in my mind to despise the etiological importance of such vulgar agents. They are very various and frequent, and being accused almost always by the patients themselves, they become more evident than the specific causes of the neuroses, hidden and ignored etiology. Very often they play the role of provoking agents, which make manifest the neurosis, until then latent, being linked to them a practical interest, since the consideration of these vulgar causes. It can lend support to a therapy that does not aim at a radical cure and is content to bring the condition back to its former state of latency. Now, it is never possible to verify a constant and strict relationship between one of these vulgar causes and a certain nervous condition. Thus, moral emotion is found as much in the etiology of hysteria, obsessions, and neurasthenia as in that of epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, diabetes, and many others. Common concurrent causes can also replace specific etiology in quantity, but never completely replace it. There are many cases in which all the etiological influences are represented by the hereditary condition and the specific cause, lacking the vulgar causes. In the other cases, the essential etiological factors are not sufficient due to their quantity to cause neurosis, thus resulting in an apparent state of health being maintained for a long time, which is in reality nothing more than a state of neurotic predisposition. It is enough then that a vulgar cause adds its action for the neurosis to become manifest. But in such conditions it is necessary to take into account that the nature of the supervening vulgar agent is indifferent. Whatever said agent, emotion, trauma, infectious disease, etc. The pathological effect will be the same, since the nature of the neurosis will always depend on the specific pre-existing cause. What, then, are these specific causes of neurosis? Is it just one or are there several? Can a constant etiological relationship between such a neurotic cause and such an effect be proven, so that we can ascribe a particular etiology to each of the major neuroses? Supported by a laborious examination of the facts, I have to affirm that this last supposition corresponds exactly to reality, that each of the great neuroses enumerated has as its immediate cause a particular disturbance of the nervous economy, and that these functional pathological modifications recognize the sexual life of the individual as a common origin, whether it is a disorder of the actual sexual life. They are important events of the past life. This is not really a new and unprecedented statement. Among the causes of nervousness, Sexual disorders have always been admitted, but subordinating them to heredity, coordinating them with the other provocative agents and restricting their etiological influence to a limited number of observed cases. Doctors have even gotten into the habit of not looking for them if the patient does not refer to they spontaneously. Instead, based on the results of my research, I elevate such sexual influences to the category of specific causes. I recognize its action in all cases of neurosis, and finally I find a regular parallelism, proof of a particular etiological relationship between the nature of sexual influence and the morbid species of neurosis. I am sure that this theory will provoke a storm of contradictions on the part of contemporary doctors. But this is not the place to present the documents and experiences that have imposed my conviction or to explain the true meaning of the expression, somewhat vague, nerve economy disorders. All this will be carried out with the greatest amplitude in a work that I prepare on the matter. In this study I will limit myself to enunciating my results. Neurasthenia proper, with a very monotonous clinical appearance as soon as anxiety neurosis is separated from it, fatigue, disgust, dyspepsia, flatulence, constipation, spinal paresthesias, sexual weakness, etc., recognizes no more than onanism as a specific etiology. Immoderate, or pollutions. Spontaneous. The prolonged and intense action of this pernicious sexual satisfaction is enough to provoke neurasthenic neurosis or to impose on the subject the special neurasthenic stamp that manifests itself later under the influence of an occasional accessory cause. I have also found people who presented the signs of a neurasthenic constitution, and in whom I have not obtained evidence of the aforementioned etiology, but at least I have managed to verify that the sexual function had never developed in them to the normal level, seeming endowed with inheritance of a sexual constitution analogous to that produced in the neurasthenic as a consequence of onanism. Anxiety neurosis, whose clinical picture is much richer, irritability, anxious waiting state, phobias, complete or rudimentary anxiety attacks, fear, vertigo, tremors, sweating, congestion, dyspnea, tachycardia, etc., chronic diarrhea, vertigo, chronic locomotion, hyperesthesia, insomnia, etc., is easily revealed as the specific effect of various disorders of the sexual life, which are not without a common character to all. Forced abstinence, frustrated genital arousal, not satisfied by the sexual act, imperfect or interrupted intercourse, sexual efforts that exceed the psychic capacity of the subject, etc., all these agents. Very frequent in modern life, they coincide in disturbing the balance of psychic and somatic functions in sexual acts, preventing the psychic participation necessary to free the nervous system from genetic tension. These observations, which perhaps contain the germ of a theoretical explanation of the functional mechanism of anxiety neurosis, show at the same time that it is not yet possible today to develop a complete and truly scientific exposition of the matter, it being necessary to first address the problem. Physiology of sexual life from a new point of view. Lastly, I will say that the pathogenesis of neurasthenia and anxiety neurosis can dispense with the concurrence of a hereditary disposition. This is confirmed, in fact, by my daily observations. But if heredity concurs, it will exert a formidable influence on the development of neurosis. For the second class of major neuroses, hysteria and obsessional neurosis, the solution of the etiological problem is surprisingly simple and uniform. I owe my results to the use of a new method of psychoanalysis, to the exploratory procedure of J. Brewer, somewhat subtle, but irreplaceable for its effectiveness in illuminating the dark paths of unconscious ideation. Through this procedure, the description of which we shall not undertake here, the hysterical symptoms are traced back to their origin, always constituted by a event of the sexual life of the individual, very appropriate to produce a painful emotion. Exploring the past tense of the patient step by step, always guided by the organic chain of symptoms, memories, and waking thoughts, we have managed to reach the starting point of the pathological process, and we have verified that in the background of all cases subjected to analysis, there was also the action of an agent that had to be accepted as a specific cause of the hysteria. It is, of course, a memory related to life. Sexual, but that offers two characters of maximum importance. The event of which the subject has retained an unconscious memory is an early sexual experience with actual arousal of the genital parts, followed by sexual abuse by another person, and the period of life in which this fatal event occurred is childhood to the 8 or 10 years old, before the child has reached sexual maturity. Thus, the specific etiology of hysteria is constituted by an experience of sexual passivity prior to puberty. We will add without delay some detailed facts and some comments to the stated result in order to avoid the mistrust that we know our statements must arouse. We have been able to carry out the complete psychoanalysis of 13 cases of hysteria, 3 of which were true combinations of hysteria with obsessional neurosis, and not hysteria with obsessions. None of them lacked the event described above, being represented by a brutal attack committed by an adult or by a less rapid and less repulsive seduction, but leading to the same end. Of the 13 cases, 7 involved relationships between child subjects, that is, sexual intercourse between a girl and a boy slightly older than her, almost always her brother, victim of a previous seduction. These relations had sometimes continued for whole years, until the puberty of the little culprits, the child always repeating with his partner, without any innovation, the same practices to which he had been subjected before by a servant or a governess, and which because of this origin were often of a repugnant nature. In some cases, child relationships and repeated brutal assault or abuse concurred. The date of early experience was variable. In 2 cases the series began at 2 years, of the infant subject. But the most frequent age was between 4 and 5 years. Maybe it will be random. But my observations have given me the impression that an experience of sexual passivity after the age of 8 to 10 years can no longer serve as a basis for the formation of a neurosis. How can one be convinced of the reality of these confessions obtained in analysis, which claim to be memories preserved from early childhood, and how one can guard against the inclination to lie and the facility for invention attributed to hysterics? I myself would accuse myself of reprehensible credulity if I didn't. Other more conclusive evidence was available. But it is that the patients never tell these stories spontaneously, nor will they ever offer the doctor the complete memory of such a scene during the course of treatment. The physical imprint of the early sexual event cannot be awakened except through the most energetic pressure of the analytic procedure and in the struggle against enormous resistance. It is necessary. Ripping off the memory piece by piece, and while it awakens in their consciousness, the patients are shown to be invaded by an emotion that is difficult to fake. The early sexual event leaves an imperishable mark on the history of the case, appearing represented in it by a multitude of symptoms and particular features that do not admit another explanation, being demanded in a peremptory way by the subtle but solid linkage of the intrinsic structure of neurosis. Finally, when one does not penetrate to that event, the therapeutic effect of the analysis fails, and thus there is no choice but to accept or refute it altogether. Can it be understood that such a precocious sexual experience suffered by an individual whose sex has barely differentiated yet becomes the origin of a persistent psychic abnormality, such as hysteria? And how to harmonize such a hypothesis with our current ideas about the psychic mechanism of this neurosis? We can give a satisfactory answer to the first of these questions, precisely because it is a child subject, it does not produce. The arousal has no effect, but its psychic imprint lingers. Later, when with puberty the reactivity of the sexual organs is developed to an immeasurable level in relation to the infantile state, this unconscious psychic imprint is revived, and because of the transformation due to puberty, the memory displays a power that the event itself totally lacked. The memory then acts as if it were a present event. It is therefore, so to speak, a posthumous action of a sexual trauma. As far as we know, this awakening of sexual memory After puberty, the event itself having occurred at a time well before that period, is the only psychological possibility. That the immediate action of a memory exceeds that of the current event. But it must be taken into account that this is an abnormal constellation, which attacks a weak side of the psychic mechanism and necessarily produces a pathological psychic effect. In my opinion, this inverse relationship between the psychic effect of the memory and that of the event entails the reason why the memory remains unconscious. Thus we come to a very complex psychic problem, but one which, when duly appreciated, promises one day to shed vivid clarity on the most delicate questions of psychic life. The ideas presented here, taking as their starting point the fact that psychoanalysis always reveals to us, as the specific cause of hysteria, the memory of an early sexual experience, do not agree with the psychological theory of neurosis held by Janet nor with any other, but they do harmonize perfectly with my own speculations about defense neuroses. All events after puberty, to which an influence on the development of hysterical neurosis and on the formation of its symptoms must be attributed, are in reality only concurrent causes, provoking agents, as Charcot said, for whom he held the nervous heredity the position that I claim for the precocious sexual experience. These accessory agents are not subject to the strict conditions attached to specific causes. The analysis irrefutably demonstrates that only because of their ability to awaken the unconscious psychic imprint of the childhood event do they enjoy a pathogenic influence in relation to hysteria. Their connection with the primary pathogenic imprint is what brings their memory into the unconscious, thus empowering them to contribute to the development of an activity. Psychic removed from the power of conscious functions. Obsessional neurosis comes from a specific cause very similar to that of hysteria. We also find in her an early sexual event that occurred before puberty, the memory of which is activated at this time or after it, and the same reasoning and observations expounded on the occasion of hysteria can be applied to the observed cases of this neurosis, 6, 3 of them very pure. There is only one important difference. At the bottom of the hysterical etiology we have found an event of sexual passivity, an experience tolerated with indifference or with anger or fear. In obsessional neurosis, on the contrary, it is a question of an event that has caused pleasure, of a sexual assault inspired by desire, male infant subject, or of a joyous participation in sexual relations, female infant subject. Obsessive ideas, recognized by analysis in their, in an intimate sense, reduced, so to speak, to their simplest expression, they are nothing more than reproaches that the subject addresses for anticipated sexual enjoyment, although reproaches disfigured by an unconscious psychic work of transformation and substitution. The very fact that such sexual assaults take place at such a tender age seems to denounce the influence of a previous seduction, of which the precocity of sexual desire is a consequence. In the cases I have analyzed have always confirmed this suspicion. In this way, a constant fact in these cases of obsessional neurosis is explained, that is, the regular complication of the picture. Symptomatic for a certain number of simply hysterical symptoms. The importance of the active element of sexual life in the etiology of obsessions and that of passivity in the pathogenesis of hysteria even seem to reveal the reason for the more intimate connection of hysteria with the female sex and for the preference of the male for obsessive neurosis. Sometimes we find two neurotics who in their childhood formed a couple of childish lovers, and in these cases the man suffers from obsessional neurosis and the woman from hysteria. When it comes to brother and sister, it is not difficult to make the mistake of attributing to nervous heredity what is nothing more than an effect of early sexual experiences. There are, of course, isolated and pure cases of hysteria or obsessional neurosis independent of neurasthenia or anxiety neurosis, but this is not the general. Psychoneurosis is usually. It appears as accessory or neurasthenic neurosis, as evoked by it, or following its decline. This is due to the fact that the specific causes of these neuroses, that is, the current disorders of sexual life, act at the same time as accessory causes of the psychoneuroses whose specific cause, the memory of the experience. Early sexual awaken and revive. With regard to nervous inheritance, I am still very far from being able to accurately assess its influence on the etiology of psychoneurosis. I concede that his presence is essential in serious cases, and I doubt that it is so in mild ones, but I am convinced that by itself it cannot produce psychoneurosis when its etiology specific early sexual arousal lack. I even go so far as to think that the question of determining which of the neuroses, hysteria or obsessional neurosis, develops in a given case does not depend on heredity, but on a special character of said early sexual event. And the inheritance and etiology of the neurosis. Sigmund Freud.